Hello, hello. It's Eileen here, and I've got a quick update that I wanted to be sure to share with you before we dive into today's episode. The Resilience Room membership community is going to open its doors for new members Monday, July 28th through Friday, August 1st. If you've been thinking of joining us and want to be sure to be notified when we open, I want to encourage you to join the waitlist. You can do that at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. That's go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. We only open our doors for new members a few times per year, so if you've been thinking about joining, this is a great time for you to do that. We would love nothing more than to welcome you into our amazing community. So again, you can find all the details and join the waitlist at go.eileendivine.com/resilience room. Okay, on to the episode. His interests and his topics of conversation are really what you would imagine from a much younger child, say 10 or 11 years old. And in fact, his parents have noticed that he does really well with his cousins who are all around this age. So when it comes to social and emotional skills, he's much more like a 10-year-old versus his chronological age of 14. Hi there, and welcome to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and I am a therapist, parent coach, and educator who supports parents that are raising children, teens, and young adults with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. If you are a parent or caregiver of a child who has intense, confusing, relentless, or sometimes even scary behaviors, you are in the right place, and I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hey there, welcome back to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I am so glad you are here. I am your host, Eileen Devine, and the topic I have for you today is one that I knew I needed to tackle early on in this podcast when I decided to create this Brain First Parenting podcast because of how critical this topic, this issue is to understanding kids with brain-based differences, which of course includes understanding their challenging behaviors that can often be so difficult to make sense of. I work with a lot of parents who describe to me a level of immaturity in their child that just seems to never go away or change. And these parents describe how their child or their teen, even at older ages, continue to do things that are not at all what we would expect from a child of their age. And it's really baffling and at times a bit maddening for the parent, understandably. They find themselves saying to their child or their teen things like, "Why are you acting this way? It's totally inappropriate for you to be doing this at your age. You need to grow up." So what I want to talk to you about today is why that is such a common occurrence with children and teens, young adults who have brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. When we understand why they are acting that way, then we understand the root cause of that behavior. And then you don't feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall every time it comes up. You see it for what it is, and then you understand the lagging skills behind that challenging behavior, that immature behavior, and then you can support them in ways that help them grow in their maturity. So these immature behaviors are viewed by society and oftentimes by us as parents before we have any other way to see them. They're viewed through a behavioral lens. meaning people see our kids or our teens acting this way, like a much younger child, very immaturely. They see those behaviors as willful, as intentional, and that's why we and others react the way we do sometimes to these behaviors. We say things like, you need to grow up, or you're acting like a baby, you need to knock it off, or you're too old to be acting that way. And why wouldn't we? When we have no other way to make sense of those behaviors except seeing it through a behavioral lens, that is the obvious conclusion. So that's what I want to focus on today, is how to see those behaviors through a brain first lens so that you can understand how it's connected to your child's unique brain and how to support them with that in mind. So when we look at these behaviors through this brain first lens, it creates a whole lot of understanding and clarity for us. We're not so confused and so baffled about what's happening with them. What is happening with them is that your child or your teen is experiencing what we call dysmaturity. Dysmaturity, if you're new to that term, it comes from Diane Malbin's neurobehavioral model, and it is when there is a gap that exists between the developmental age and the chronological age of an individual. There is this gap between where that individual is in their skills and behavior and where our larger society expects them to be at their chronological age. So it is a universal characteristic when it comes to individuals living with brain-based differences, meaning I have never worked with a family whose child or teen or young adult did not experience some amount of dysmaturity. And it did not matter what their child's diagnosis was. So it is not diagnosis specific, it's brain specific. And because it is a universal characteristic for people living with brain-based differences, I believe wholeheartedly that it is absolutely essential to fully understand this and how it shows up for your child, dysmaturity, so that you can then support them with that knowledge, that understanding in mind. Now, what can and very often does vary from one child to another is the degree of dysmaturity that they experience. So, for example, kids with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, which is my daughter's diagnosis, it can be a quite a profound gap, quite drastic. You could take that child or that teen's chronological age and divide it in half, and that's typically a good starting point to begin understanding their level of dysmaturity and how it impacts their life. So as many of you know, my daughter is 16, and she often reminds me of a mature 8-year-old in the way she understands what's happening around her, her interests, the way she relates to others. It's often around that 8 or 9-year-old age range. With other kids and teens with other diagnoses, it may not be as severe of a difference. It may not be half their chronological age, but there is still a difference there that is significant enough that it impacts how they see the world, how they understand the world around them, and how they navigate it. So, for example, say you have a 13-year-old and there are I say just in quotes, just a few years of dysmaturity. So they're much more, say, like an 11-year-old or maybe a 10-year-old. That's a 2 or 3 year difference, but a huge, huge gap developmentally in terms of their maturity and their skill development. That 10 years old to 13 is a really drastic difference. Now, because there's unfortunately not some concrete formula that I can give you to determine your child's level of dysmaturity, the way you begin to understand the degree of that dysmaturity for your unique child is by actively working to see your child through a brain first lens of curiosity and empathy with this concept in mind so that you can begin to notice when it comes up, when you see it, and then you start to see it for what it is. So when you are met with a really frustrating or problematic behavior from your child or your teen, or maybe they did something to you that you just can't even begin to make sense of, like, why would they have ever thought doing that was okay or a good idea? What were they thinking? Or maybe they do something, say at an older age, that is really embarrassing for a child of their age. And you feel that embarrassment for them, right? And maybe even for yourself as their parent. I want to encourage you to try to get a little bit of space between that behavior and your reaction to it and ask yourself what dysmaturity might have to do with all of this, whatever it is that's happening, whatever it is you're experiencing with them in that moment. You can do that by asking yourself this simple but really powerful question: what age does this behavior remind me of? I have a wonderful niece. She lives close by, and so we spend a lot of time with her. And she is 3 years younger than my daughter. So she's 13, my daughter's 16, and they've grown up together. And I can remember when my daughter was 6 and my niece was about 3. And in a lot of ways, they were really great playmates because of this dysmaturity. My daughter was very similar to her in her interests and the way she played. But what was also true for them was they were still developing skills that made playing together successful. So if you've ever spent time with a group of 3-year-olds, you know that they lag behind in some pretty essential skills to getting along. Things like being able to compromise or being able to take turns, right? Or being able to tolerate frustrations when something doesn't go exactly their way, to be able to negotiate, right, with their playmate. These were all skills that my 3-year-old niece was still developing because that's very developmentally appropriate, where we would expect her to be at 3. But it was also true for my 6-year-old at the time, 6-year-old daughter. So they would be playing well, and then all of a sudden they weren't, because they didn't have the skills to do that independently. They needed our help to help facilitate that play, help them repair, help them share and take turns, and all of those kinds of things. If I had not understood dysmaturity at that point, if my husband had not understood, if my extended family had not understood this key concept of dysmaturity, what would have happened? I can guarantee you that my daughter would have always been in trouble. Why are you acting that way? You're older. She doesn't know better, but you do, right? None of that was true. She didn't know better. She was still developing the skills that were in alignment with the skills that a 3-year-old is still developing. That is why recognizing and understanding where dysmaturity is so important and so critical. Now, it doesn't mean that we then say, well, she's 6, but really in this skill set, she's 3. I see it for what it is. So we just kind of let her act however she wants to act. No, we understand, that's where she is with the skill set of being able to negotiate, compromise, share, take turns, roll with the punches in terms of frustrations, right? And so we would take a step back and say, how do we support a child of that age in building these essential skills? That's the difference. Now, there is an added layer to this. And when thinking about dysmaturity and how it shows up for our kids, this added layer can get a little tricky. So I want to unpack it a bit more to help you deepen your understanding of your child when it comes to dysmaturity even more. Dysmaturity and how it shows up in our kids is uneven. So what do I mean by that? Let's say, for example, you have a 14-year-old teenage son. We'll call him Joe. And Joe is a freshman in high school, and he lives with a serious neurobehavioral difference. Let's just say that his diagnosis happens to be ADHD. And this brain difference is largely invisible, meaning he looks, for the most part, like his peers, except for some pretty challenging behavioral symptoms that, of course, are not recognized as symptoms, right? So he's at high school and he is at high risk for being misunderstood and being punished for his differences instead of provided with accommodations because of how invisible his differences can be at times. So just like all of our kids, Joe has strengths, and his happens to be that he's a really talented soccer player. He's really physically talented and inclined. He loves the sport, and it's one of the only places that he actually excels, right? It brings him some confidence. It brings him some popularity amongst his peers, a sense of belonging. So it's a really important piece of his life. He manages to have a social circle, mainly through playing soccer, that his parents tell me is pretty fragile. They can see that it's a pretty fragile social circle and it's pretty surface level friendships, but for the most part, it's working for Joe. He's happy. So Joe, just like all kids with neurobehavioral differences, experiences dysmaturity. That gap between his developmental age and his chronological age. And it shows up in a few ways, and it's uneven. So one way that it shows up is in his social skills. And I mentioned that he has some friends, but it's pretty surface level. It's somewhat fragile friendships. His friends often feel like he's a bit much, and he doesn't know when to tone it down. They're constantly telling him to knock it off and grow up. His interests and his topics of conversation are really what you would imagine from a much younger child, say 10 or 11 years old. And in fact, his parents have noticed that he does really well with his cousins who are all around this age. So when it comes to social and emotional skills, he's much more like a 10-year-old versus his chronological age of 14. Joe also shows some dysmaturity in his receptive language. So the way he understands the back and forth of conversations, the way he's able to hold a conversation, the unspoken context that's happening when he's talking with others, that it's obvious to everybody else, but not obvious to him. His parents, when they take a step back to think about it, they're like, yeah, when it comes to this skill set, we see him much like his young cousins, like much more like a 9 or 10-year-old in this area. Now, what makes this super confusing, and again, where there is uneven development, is that his expressive language is quite developed. It's pretty mature. He can definitely sound like his same age peers. So he can talk the talk, but because of that lagging skill with his receptive language, he can't walk the walk. Joe also experiences some dysmaturity around being able to follow directions because his processing speed is a bit slower than you'd expect a teen of his age. He can only hold one direction in his mind at a time. So if he's given directions quickly or say 3 to 5 steps to do all at once, which is not uncommon expectation for his age, his chronological age, instead of just carrying out those 3 to 5 steps all at once, he does the first step and then he gets lost. And he doesn't have any clue about what he's supposed to be doing. And when his parents take a step back to think about what age that reminds them of, they're like, yeah, when we see this at play, it really reminds us of maybe a 7 or an 8-year-old, the expectations that you would have of a child of that age. So that uneven development with Joe is going to understandably cause confusion for people in his environments, like his soccer coach, right? If it's not understood, they will see it through a behavioral lens. And what does that look like? So if his soccer coach does not understand the dysmaturity and sees it through a behavioral lens, he'll see Joe as a kid who's always intentionally messing around and being silly and not paying attention, that he doesn't care about listening to the coach or following the directions. It would likely mean that Joe's always in trouble at practice. And then maybe he's benched for a game because he's not doing what he's supposed to do in practice. And then maybe even when his coach loses complete patience with him, he's kicked off the team because all the behaviors the coach is seeing in Joe is being seen through this behavioral lens as intentional and willful defiance. And then his social circle that was really built on his talents as a soccer player, those begin to crumble because he's not on the team anymore. If the coach had any understanding of Joe's brain-based difference, his dysmaturity, the uneven development in all these different areas, how this is all at play and is reflected through Joe's behaviors, his entire high school experience could be dramatically different in the most positive ways. I have seen situations happen like this over and over and over again with the parents that I work with. And I can see how powerful it is when dysmaturity is fully recognized and given the weight that it deserves when it comes to seeing our kids and their behaviors through a brain first lens. Now, as you know, I never end an episode without talking about the parent experience in all of this because it always matters. And it is such a critical aspect of parenting from a brain first lens. So let's talk about our experience as the parents of kids who experience this gap, this dysmaturity. In my work with parents over the past decade, I have found that dysmaturity is one of the most difficult truths for parents to fully and consistently integrate into this new understanding of their child or their teen. Now, why is this? I believe one of the reasons is that it's just hard for us to remember. When you have a 16-year-old standing in front of you, it's really hard to remember that they are not 16 in so many ways. So that's the first reason. I think the other reason is that it stirs up a lot of emotions for us, like fear and grief and sadness. So it's really hard to accept it fully when we have all of that emotion there, all stirred up, right? It leads to understandable questions, like if my child is half their age in these skills or developmentally or socially, emotionally, what does that mean for their future, right? And what does that mean for my future as their parent? Will my child ever be able to be fully independent, like as an adult? Will they ever find a place or a community where they fit in and are truly accepted for who they are? Will they ever catch up? Or does that developmental gap, does that dysmaturity always remain? And what does that look like, right? Many parents tell me that they start to fully recognize the impact that dysmaturity has on their child when younger siblings start to surpass their older child in different skill sets. And that can be really hard to see too. That is exactly what happened with my daughter and her cousin that I mentioned, who's 3 years younger than her. So my daughter just turned 16, and at her birthday party, she was so excited for the stuffed animals that she received as gifts. And because my daughter's development is uneven, she was excited about the stuffed animals, but she was also hoping for an iPhone for her birthday, something that is definitely appropriate for a 16-year-old. Her younger cousin has not been interested in stuffed animals or make-believe for quite some time, understandably. She's 13. And she has relational cognitive skills that my daughter is still working really hard on developing. So she has surpassed my daughter in her cognitive skills, relationally and otherwise, really in every way. And although we recognized my daughter's dysmaturity and this gap really early on, seeing her grow up over the years with her younger cousin has really highlighted it for us. We see it for what it is. So that can be really hard for a parent who has younger siblings who they start to now see surpass the older sibling in these skill sets. As hard as it can be, for us as parents to truly ease into the acceptance that your child experiences dysmaturity and everything that that means for them. It's so critical for their well-being and their ability to truly be allowed to be who they are in their different environments. And once you start looking for it and you start seeing it for what it is, you can't unsee it. And oftentimes, over time, you begin to see like, oh man, this is a bigger gap than I realized, right? And again, while that can be really hard when that realization hits you, can bring up lots of grief and sadness, it's really critical because it's so foundational to our kids' experience of the world and who they are and why they behave the way they do and what level of support and accommodations they need from us to be successful. I believe that our work as parents is to continuously work to remain curious about where dysmaturity shows up and ask ourselves the question, what age does this behavior remind me of? And then from there, how would I support a child of that age in taking on this responsibility or finishing this task or meeting this expectation? Really getting clear with ourselves whether or not we've adjusted our expectations to have them in full alignment with where our kids are developmentally. So these questions really do have the power to reframe everything we thought we knew about what was happening in that moment, and that is not a bad thing. Before I say goodbye, I wanted to be sure to let you know that this isn't the only way that we can stay in touch. Every week, I pop into the inbox of thousands of other parents just like you with a short note that's focused on various aspects of this unique parenting experience. If that sounds like something that would be helpful to you, you can join my email list by going to my website, eileendivine.com.